You are standing in an airport, 2 hours early, holding a coffee that costs $7 and a bottle of water that costs $6. At LaGuardia, they once sold a single beer for $27.85. The airport's own overseers called that price, quote, totally indefensible. And you assume this is just what happens when a travel business squeezes travelers. Only it is not. Because the airport you are standing in is barely in the travel business at all. In Atlanta, the busiest airport on Earth, every airline on the field, all of them combined, paid the airport about $239 million in a year. The parking lots on their own made almost as much. Landing a fully loaded Boeing 737 there costs about $147. Parking your car for the week can cost you more than the airline paid to land the plane. The planes are not the product. The planes are the bait that delivers you. By the end of this video, you will see the 3 businesses hiding behind the departures board. A shopping mall so ruthless that its biggest tenant recently paid more in rent than it made in sales. A landlord that owns more land than Manhattan, with its own zip code and its own police force, and a toll booth with a license nobody else can ever get. Where, and this is the strangest part, going over budget is not a failure. It is the business model. And at the end, the story of the investors who bought the most famous airport in the world with borrowed money, milked it for nearly 2 decades, and walked away billions richer 1 year before its best year ever. Start with the shops. And here is the part that should bother you. The shops are the smallest of the 3 businesses. The one hiding underneath them is where the real money is. But you have already been inside this machine and you never felt it working. Think about what security actually does to you. It takes a person with somewhere to be, strips away their sense of control, and releases them into a curated corridor of shops with, on average, 111 minutes to kill. The industry calls what comes next the golden hour. You cannot leave, you cannot be late anymore. You are relaxed, relieved, and slightly bored, which is the exact emotional state a retailer dreams about. And the buildings are drawn around that state. In American hubs, roughly 90% of the shopping space sits after security, not before it. The path from the checkpoint to your gate does not go past the shops by accident. The shops are the path. And you never clock it, because every minute of that hour feels like your own idea, and the prices are not lawless. That is the strange part. Most big American airports run a rule called Street Pricing Plus, which means the terminal is allowed to charge about 10% more than the same shop charges downtown. That $28 beer was such a scandal precisely because there were rules. The machine does not need to gouge you. It needs volume, and it has a captive city of customers every single day. This whole idea has a birthday and a father. In 1947, a catering manager named Brendan O'Regan watched transatlantic flights refuel at Shannon Airport in Ireland and asked a question nobody had asked. What if the airport itself was outside the tax system? Ireland passed a law. The world's first duty-free shop opened at Shannon, and every airport on Earth eventually copied it. Decades later, an Irishman named Cole McLaughlin opened the duty-free at Dubai. On day 1, it took in about $44,000. Last year, it took in nearly $2.4 billion, roughly $25 for every single passenger who moved through that airport. But here's the number that shows you who really holds the power. At Incheon, one of the finest airports ever built, the duty-free operator recently paid more money in rent to the airport than it collected in total sales. Read that again. The shop lost money on every bag of cosmetics so that the landlord could not lose it all. Its rivals paid over $100 million each in penalties just to escape their own leases early. When the tenants are bleeding and the landlord is fine, you are not looking at a retail business. You are looking at a rent machine, which brings us to the ground itself. Because the mall is just what they built on top of the real asset. In America, the single biggest moneymaker at the airport, bigger than every shop and every duty-free counter combined, is the parking garage. $6 billion a year flows out of parking lots, nearly half of everything American airports earn beyond the airlines. While Atlanta charged that Boeing $147 to land, it tripled its parking rates. Even the rideshare apps pay the machine. Uber alone hands one airport in Texas around $19 million a year just for the right to pick you up at the curb. And that Texas airport tells you what these places really are. Dallas-Fort Worth covers more than 17,000 acres. That is bigger than Manhattan. It has its own zip code, its own police force. 2 hotels owned outright. It is not an airport. It is a small country you drive through to catch a flight. And here is the part nobody puts on a departures board. Denver sits on even more land, including 16,000 acres it has admitted it will never need for aviation. So it is building what it openly calls an airport city, offices, warehouses, hotels, on farmland it bought decades ago. Amsterdam's airport runs a property arm that collects 200 million euros a year in rent and books rising property values as profit, exactly like a real estate fund. One American professor, John Casarda, gave this creature a name, the Erythropolis, a city that grows around a runway the way old cities grew around a harbor. The runway is not the point. The runway is what makes the land valuable. And now the third business, the quietest one and the most powerful, the toll booth. Every plane that lands pays a landing fee. Every passenger who takes off pays a charge buried inside the ticket. You have paid it dozens of times. You have never once seen it itemized. At Heathrow, the most expensive airport on Earth, that charge works out to about £26 per passenger, and a long-haul traveler can carry a fee of nearly £50 per person per flight. The airlines hate it. Here is what happens when they fight back. When Amsterdam's airport raised its fees 37%, its own home airline KLM took it to court. KLM lost. The next year, charges went up again, because where exactly is the airline going to go? There is one Heathrow, one Schiphol, one Atlanta. The regulator itself concluded these airports hold substantial market power. That is the polite term for a monopoly you are allowed to keep. Ada, how much is access to a monopoly worth? At Heathrow, the right to land and take off once per day, a single pair of slots, has changed hands for $75 million. Not a plane, not a gate, a time of day. Virgin Atlantic recently borrowed $745 million from a private equity firm, and the collateral was 27 pairs of those slots. They mortgaged thin air, and the lenders said yes. But the true genius of the toll booth is a rule most passengers have never heard of. Regulated airports like Heathrow earn a guaranteed return on what they spend building the airport. The bigger the asset base, the bigger the allowed profit. Sit with that. If Heathrow spends more on a terminal, its permitted earnings go up. When it refurbished one tunnel, the cost ran over by 840%, from £66 million to over $500 million, and the machine did not suffer, because gold plating is not a leak in this system. It is the system. But that is still not the boldest part. Airlines say Heathrow now runs over £1 billion a year more expensive than its European rivals. The head of the global airline lobby, Willie Walsh, calls it gold-plated construction, and the next act is already approved, a £49 billion third runway where the regulator has proposed letting the airport start charging passengers for the planning paperwork roughly a decade before the first plane uses it. You will pay for the runway before it exists. So who actually gets rich off a machine like this? Let me tell you about the smart money. In 2006, a Spanish construction family, the company Ferrovial, bought the owner of Heathrow for about £10 billion. And here is the trick. They only put down $4.5 billion of their own. The rest was debt loaded onto the airport itself. Not their debt, the airport's debt. Within a year, the airport's liabilities had roughly doubled. Then the machine did what the machine does. Between 2012 and 2017, the owners pulled around £3 billion in dividends out of it, while the operating company paid barely over $100 million in tax on more than $8 billion of operating profit. £3 billion out, $100 million in tax. Read that ratio again. And then, having ridden it for nearly 2 decades, Ferrovial sold out, walking away billions richer. The year after they left, Heathrow had the best year in its history, a record 84.5 million passengers and its first dividend in 5 years. The machine did not miss them. The machine does not miss anyone, so what could actually break it? There is really only one thing that can take a machine like this down, and it already happened once. One night in March of 2025, a single electrical substation next to Heathrow caught fire, and the most expensive airport on Earth went dark for 16 hours. Over 1,000 flights died on the board. 200,000 people were stranded. The fault had been flagged 7 years earlier, and the fire suppression system had been dead for 3, and the chief executive slept through the night with his phone on silent. That is the real bear case, not competition. There is no competition. The dangers are self-inflicted. Aging equipment, angry regulators shaving the toll, and passengers who buy less in the shops than they used to because duty-free spending per traveler has been sliding for years. But notice what none of that touches. The land is still the land. The slots are still the slots. The toll booth reopened at sunrise the next day, and that same year the passengers came back in record numbers anyway. You cannot boycott the only bridge out of town. So here is the only question that matters. Now that you can see all three businesses, the mall that owns your golden hour, the landlord that owns the ground under the parking garage, and the toll booth inside your ticket price, what do you do at the gate next time? Do you walk past every shop, buy nothing, and beat the machine out of $8? Or do you buy the water and the coffee anyway because you are 2 hours early and the machine owns your time either way? Be honest, tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know.